knowing that lunch is next. So I have to respect the fact that I am the impediment between you and lunch today. So we'll go ahead and get started. Most of the time that I'm at Agile conferences, it feels a little bit like you've either gone to a Star Trek convention or a Star Wars convention, or you've gone to a yoga retreat, because you hear these sage, wise words, and they're delivered to you so that you can live your life in the philosophy and the zen that is Agile. So I always think of Agile Yoda whenever I'm at a conference like this. The workshop today normally has 8 hours of time together, and we have these really cool examples and exercises that we work on together, and we make big messes. You know that you've done a lot whenever you make a big mess at an Agile conference or workshop. Unfortunately, I only have an hour and a half of your time today. So it'll be a little more lecture-like than I like, but we have retrospectives built in so that you can participate and we can adjust course to make sure you're getting the most value out of today. The workshop is called Lean Accessibility, Building Inclusive Design into Your Agile Workflow. And my name is Elle Waters. I'm the Director of Strategy at Simply Accessible. As you can probably tell, I am not from Spain, and I'm not even from Europe. I am not even probably from what you would consider a Yankee state. I am from Louisville, Kentucky, so I am pretty far flung away from this, but we are global citizens, and so we share a lot in common. If you wanted to tweet today, we have CAS 2016, as most people are using, and there is a hashtag that's pretty common with accessibility on Twitter. Just like internationalization is I18N, accessibility it's a really long word, so to conserve space, it's A11Y is typically what people use when they talk about accessibility on Twitter. So lean-A11Y is a nice short hashtag in case you did want to carry on a conversation while we're having this workshop. My Twitter handle is Nethermind, and please, I love email. I know that's kind of old-fashioned to say, but I love communications. So if you want to contact me, I am l@simplyaccessible.com. So there was a time when we all thought, we really did, we can admit it, waterfall was wonderful, because we could be so impressed with ourselves when we build these large system requirements documents, and everything in our project plan looked beautiful, and we knew that if everyone would just do as they were told, there would be a rainbow at the end of that project, and we would feel so happy about our accomplishment. Waterfall is a lie, we know. I'll go ahead and say it. That it's not the beautiful picture that we think, because human beings mess up the plan, and they're constantly changing things. Since that time, people have grown to embrace Agile, and most of the time that you hear about accessibility, it gets sort of a bad reputation, because people think it slows a project down. They think that there are a lot of reasons why not to invest in accessibility. But I'm here today to tell you that accessibility and Agile go together like peanut butter and jelly. They are best friends, and they help one another. So hopefully today, you'll see the reasoning behind that, and you'll use both to be able to make your projects more successful. So, time boxing today, we have a few things, and I put it into sprints. So how should we organize our time together? Sprint 1, what is accessibility? So if you don't know a lot about accessibility, it's helpful for us to all get a shared understanding together. We'll spend about 15 minutes. Normally that's a much longer kind of introductory workshop, but just a brief overview for you. Then sprint 2, why would you consider accessibility in your project? We'll spend another 15 minutes going through that to talk about the benefits of accessibility. And then the largest piece of what we'll do in Sprint 3, which is really what I anticipate that you guys are here for, is how do you do accessibility in a lean way, in an agile way in your projects? We'll spend about 45 minutes on that, and if we have time, we'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A and discussion. Ready? Here we go. All right, Sprint 1, what is accessibility? Wikipedia, which is where we always start, right? Wikipedia says, web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. When sites are correctly designed, developed, and edited, all users have equal access to information and functionality. Very high level, nice, in a Wikipedia way, not super useful. Our company, which all we do is accessibility, and all we do is accessibility in an agile way, basically sums it up as this. It's for every person, for every device. Or to put it differently, making things work for everyone regardless of their abilities. So some of you guys have looked at accessibility before, and you've seen the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's an international set of standards that has the remarkable talent of being incredibly dense, difficult reading, and not at all specific enough. So it's a lot of information that doesn't actually give you what you need all the time, but it's a really general set of guidelines. And so it's great for pointing the road out of where you should head. It breaks things down into 4 principles, and people like to use this as an acronym called POUR, which stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable is simply this. An example would be providing text equivalents and alternatives for content. So if the content itself, for example, and we won't go through this today, is a video, which this is a wonderful video, and I encourage you guys to look at this, caption this, and it's about the need for captions on video for the deaf and hard of hearing. And without that, it's not an alternate source of content, a text equivalent, it's the primary source of understanding. For people who aren't able to hear the audio, it's how they understand and consume that content. Operable, one example, and this is pretty much the key example that is most worthwhile to think about. Make functionality available to a keyboard and assistive technologies. So this is a picture of a man who uses a stylus because he doesn't have the use of his arms. And you can see he has a curved keyboard because that way he doesn't have to lean in to be able to tap letters on the keyboard that are farther away. It's curved to be able to fit his needs. And he taps out on this keyboard, and basically he is a sighted keyboard user. Another example would be someone who might be blind, but they're also a Braille reader. And so what they use is a combination of assistive technologies. They'll use something called a screen reader, which is basically reading the web page audibly, but then they'll also have this device, which is really cool and looks a bit like a Casio keyboard. It's a refreshable Braille device, and so it lifts up in Braille exactly what's being read aloud by the screen reader. Understandable. One example, pretty straightforward, I think, hopefully. Make content readable, intuitive, and predictable. This is a picture of our homepage on our website, and we have a bookmarklet that is simply called Make This Hard to Read. It's not meant to be an exact experience of what it's like to be someone with a learning disability, but it gives you a little bit of a simulation. So I'm going to change it, and we can look at this now and see, once we've applied this bookmarklet. You can kind of read this. We're building a digital world for everyone, partly because you knew what it said before. Learn how to navigate the world of accessibility with our training, support, testing, and something else. See, this is twice as hard for those of you guys if English is not your first language, right? The example behind this is to show it's doable, right? You can translate this, you can decode this, but it takes longer and it's harder. And so therefore it adds a cognitive load on people when they're having a learning disability and having to look through really complicated text content. So it's just an example to give someone a simulated feeling of the same kind of slowed down process and frustration. And finally, robust. So this one is a great word, but it's difficult at first when you see it to understand what it means. Maximize compatibility with current and future user tools. And that means any tool. That means browsers, that means devices, that means assistive technologies. And there's a very straightforward way to accomplish this, and we'll go into it a little bit later, but it's something that people have to adapt to and recognize and think about, because this is open signal, and this is not even this year. This is October, I believe, of 2015. This is a map of all of the different screen resolutions that are available for an Android device. So when somebody says, make sure that it's above the fold, that's really impossible at this point, right? And that's one reason why we embrace mobile first, why we're excited about responsive web design, because it takes the illusion of control out of our hands. We already know that we can't control how our content is going to be received on what device with what kinds of technologies. And so accessibility is just basically saying acknowledge this and build for this kind of flexibility, so that it doesn't matter whether somebody is using a Windows 98 machine, though I can't imagine, but maybe, or they've just picked up the Google Pixel phone and they're accessing your website. Allow for it to be flexible enough content to be able to provide that. So what kinds of different disabilities do we typically need to think about? And people typically think about some ones that just come right out of the gate. Blindness. It's one of the first things, especially web developers. They're very interested in people who can't see but are able to navigate and interact with web content. Another popular one, mobility. This is actually the largest group of people with disabilities. People who might be sighted keyboard users, and they use a lot of different devices that mimic a keyboard in order to be able to be on a website. Deafness, primarily this focuses on audio content. And cognitive, sometimes that's considered, the word is neurodiversity, where someone might have autism, they might be aging into dementia, they might have just problems with memory, or they might be someone who has a learning disability. But the truth is, it's really something like this. This is the reality of this messy human existence in which we live. There are multiple types of disabilities, multiple kinds of combinations of disabilities that people experience. So, how many people have these disabilities? This is a common kind of thought, and you're not alone, and this is a judgment-free area. Isn't this really just a small group of people who happen to have some problem, right? That seems like a pretty common thought. According to the World Health Organization and Google, 1 in 7 people in the world have a disability. That's 1 billion people in the world have some kind of disability. So to put it in web developer terms, 15% of the world's population have a disability as compared to 5.2% who are using Internet Explorer. So if you're looking at the largest market share and the people that you're trying to build your site for, when you put that Internet Explorer hack in, something to consider. In the United States alone, and I'm hoping to be able to get these statistics for Spain, and if so, we'll publish this on our website as well, $200 billion per year of discretionary spending come from this one user group. So from a marketing perspective, it's a pretty powerful group of people. And many people have more than one disability, and everyone lives on this continuum as their abilities change and their challenges and combinations of things. This is something that came out in Smashing magazine several years ago, and basically the concept is design for the extremes, and you will meet the needs of the many, because there is no average user. Everyone is somewhere on this continuum. And so Susana Gonzalez recommends that we design for the extremes, and then you meet the needs of those individuals who may not have those challenges. And the extremes are people who have disabilities or have different ways of accessing content. So accessibility is not binary. It's not black and white, and it has every shade of gray in between. So we challenge people, how you view this pretty much frames how you proceed today and how you proceed going forward when it comes to considering accessibility. Here's our retrospective. So let's see. I'm my own Scrum Master. How did we do on time? 15 minutes. That's pretty good. We're doing well. What are some things that, if you guys have questions, this is a great time for us to be able to talk about that, in particular about what accessibility is. Next, we'll go into why to do that. So I'm a big believer in feedback, and I love awkward silences. So what questions do you guys have about this part? Because here to answer those.
You said mobility is the largest group.
Yep.
How large are we talking about? And what kind of mobility issues might the person have?
So that's a great question. And not all mobility problems will affect someone using the website, right? So in other words, we're right now talking about largely desktop and mobile accessibility. Very soon, next year, for example, we'll be talking about the absolute need to consider kiosks and in-store digital interfaces and how someone in a wheelchair might have to navigate through that physical space. We're approaching very quickly the Internet of Things, so mobility challenges are something to consider, partly because of right now where we're at, but also to prepare for what happens next, where we go in the digital world. So I don't have specific statistics, but I can publish that afterwards, and it depends on the country. Developing nations have a higher degree of people with disabilities than other countries. And so that's something to consider, that not all countries obviously had the same kind of percentage breakdown. With that said, less than 10% of the disabled population are people who are blind. But that is a very common thing because someone can visibly see, because they have really fancy tools and neat things, and because of the fact they're very vocal about their disability usually. People with mobility challenges, though, are a wide spectrum. Oftentimes, the most prevalent are people with cerebral palsy and people who struggle with paralysis. But there are other things, like as you're aging into disabilities, you might have a hand tremor and have a hard time being able to click on a mouse. And so you're using a keyboard more and more often because you're not able to hit those small target areas. That's one example. By far, keyboard accessibility approaches both mobility challenges, meeting those, as well as people who are non-sighted keyboard users, non-sighted users. So you'll hear that a lot today about keyboard accessibility because it handles a large majority of people with disabilities' needs, because if they aren't a keyboard user, sometimes they're using a device like a touchpad, or they're using an infrared Bluetooth device that's connecting with a virtual keyboard, and they do all of this, and basically it translates into keyboard activity by the time it hits the screen. It's a great question. And I think those percentages, like I said, vary, but we'll publish some of that as well on this. Yes?
Do you consider analphabetism as a disability?
I'm so sorry, I did not understand the word.
People who can't read.
Yes, yes.
Analphabet
Oh,
people?
non-literate or low literacy. It can be a disability. It depends on the reasoning behind it, right? Sometimes it's an education or economic thing, but oftentimes that comes from a disability. If somebody has, dyslexia or dysgraphia, it would translate as to that. And the definition of disability is multi-layered and highly political at times. People look at it as a clinical thing, or they look at it as a social thing. In truth, because of the work that we do, we look at it as a human rights definition, because ultimately we're big believers in having access to information for everyone. So you'll see us sort of campaigning for that kind of inclusive point of view in everything. But to your question, I think it depends on how someone, if they're able to learn to be able to read, then it's more of an educational challenge. But the situation still exists. Even if it's temporary, even if someone is a non-native speaker of that language, that's still a barrier between them and that content. So, something to consider. All right, you ready to go to Sprint 2? Sprint 2. Why consider accessibility? What is the value? We don't expect that people would automatically want to do this, and therefore, there's no need to actually convince someone as to why. So first, let's talk about why not. This is a picture of the Family Feud game. It's a game show, television game show. I don't know how many of you guys have ever seen it, but they take surveys from a group of people, and then two families have to compete as to how they understand what those questions are and what the answers are. So we did a survey among user experience professionals and web developers and asked them, what prevents you from incorporating accessibility into what you do? Why don't you have accessibility as something that you do every day? Survey says, number one answer, accessibility is intimidating. The answer, yes, it's very intimidating. Several years ago, when I first got into accessibility, this is a little bit like what my home office looked like, because I knew that I had to get really smart about a lot of things really fast. I was working for an organization that basically was looking to redesign all of their websites, and they had government-mandated requirements for accessibility. So I went online and went to the documentation that existed there. I purchased books, read through books, and felt like every single week there was so much that I had to learn, so many details, so many different kinds of disabilities. It was intimidating. This is a list of things that you can find, and a lot of people, this is their first stop. They'll go to the W3C. It's an understandable first step in trying to understand accessibility. And you'll see 203 general techniques for testing web accessibility. 94 of these, 30 of those, 37 of these, 5 server-side scripting techniques, 3 plain text techniques, 36 flash techniques. Why we even have those anymore, I don't know. 35 Silverlight techniques, gross. 23 PDF techniques. So what do we call this in the accessibility industry? A good start. After all of that, if you read through all of those things, sometimes you don't feel like you're any closer to understanding what is required. What do you actually have to do to make something accessible? And then there's all those devices. So then you see these things, and they're foreign to us. There's a switch device. There's something that might have faces on it. There might be different kinds of key controls. There's buttons, and you don't know how those interact with your web content. There's things that look like Casio keyboards. What is this? You might ask yourself. You might be wondering, and it's very intimidating when there's no relationship to anything that we're familiar with. And then the most popular screen reader that's out there is something that's named after a shark. How could it not be intimidating? Jaws. Sounds scary. So you want to give up over that. The number 2 answer, accessibility is hard. The answer, yes. But I'll tell you why accessibility is hard. Accessibility is hard because good design is hard. It is very easy to put out mediocre code. It's very easy to, have a bad day and decide you're really not going to do much user research and you have a better idea what your users need. Why would you test it? And just kind of, mail it in. I don't know if that phrase translates. But accessibility is hard because good design is hard. Let's look at what Apple has to say. We believe that technology should be accessible to everyone. The most powerful technology in the world is technology that everyone, including people with disabilities, can use. We don't design products for some people, or even most people. We design them for every single person. I'm a fan, a recent fan. I wasn't always an Apple fangirl, but recently, and I would say over the last 10 to 15 years, because of what Apple has done for accessibility, I've started to understand. My husband is an avid fan of Linux and likes breaking apart his computers, and so he's an anti-Apple. We have a blended marriage, you could say, and we argue quite a bit. We meet in the middle and we compromise on Google probably, but the point behind this is that Apple undeniably has understood how to be able to incorporate the value of design. They charge a lot more money for their laptops than an Acer laptop. And you could have discussions about whether or not it's the same quality or different quality, but anyone who's willing to purchase that laptop has a feeling that there's value in that. And a lot of it is because of the attention to design. So if this is where they believe this, and they believe this very strongly, it's worth considering because they've won this battle of how to be able to provide design that users and people consider valuable enough to purchase. This is a great picture off of their website. This is Sadie Paulson. She's a video editor, certified in Final Cut Pro, who uses switch control to edit films on her Mac. Switch control is the ability, she doesn't have much mobility at all, but because of the fact that Final Cut Pro is accessible, because of the fact as a software application, and her Mac is able to interact with her switch device, she's able to have a career in this. It's not just whether or not she can one time edit a video. This is her job. And so the opportunities that are opened up for her are because of the fact that someone took the attention to detail and decided to make that accessible. The number 3 answer, survey says, accessibility is not my job. Really? If user experience is our job, whether you be a product owner or a designer or a business analyst or a UX person of many flavors or a web developer, even a back-end web developer, if you're putting something out there for someone else to consume as content, that means you're in the business of user experience. And of course, user being part of that word is kind of an important thing. So why would you do this at all, though? This is a pretty common, these questions, these things that people push back on. And so this is a way of being able to equip you should you need to convince someone at your company or just to be able to settle your mind about what is the value behind accessibility. So agile principles to the rescue. The definition of value, we'll talk about that in a second, and ways to measure it. The value of lean accessibility. The cost of delay, we'll touch on that briefly, and what accessibility does for Agile. So definitions of value, there's lots of different ways that people can define value, and oftentimes like in Agile kind of lore, you'll hear the word value, but you won't hear it defined. And then you'll hear the words business value, but again, that's not defined. So happily, Christian Berwich, founder of Agilistic, and here's the link, basically comes up with some definitions of value that I think are really useful. Commercial value, work that directly translates into profit. Market value, work that increases the potential number of customers. Efficiency value, work that increases organizational efficiency and decreases operational costs. Customer value, work that increases customer loyalty. And then future value, work that increases your chances of providing more value later on. So how does lean accessibility score on this? Commercial value, We've already talked, and you can imagine if you make your content more predictable, more flexible, easier to use, that it'll increase the usability and it'll speed up your purchase paths. So absolutely there is commercial value with accessibility. Market value increases potential new customers. Well, we're talking about 15% of the world's population who may not be able to use your site right now, but obviously if you make it more accessible, then you gain those customers. So yes, check. Efficiency value. This is actually one of my favorite ones. It increases organizational efficiency and decreases operational costs. So the biggest problem that we encounter when we work with teams with accessibility is not accessibility. The biggest problem is that we have a flashlight and we're shining it into every corner of their operational process. And what we see are 8 different ways to handle error messaging, or we see not really a defined process for how you translate requirements from the business need through the entire project lifecycle. What we see are shortcuts that people take in their code, and we see lots and lots of things that essentially affect end users with disabilities, but it's not accessibility that people struggle with. It's the operational efficiency that lays that foundation for accessibility. So because accessibility needs that in order to be successful, it absolutely benefits and creates efficiency value. Customer value increases customer loyalty. So there is something very specific about people with disabilities and their loyalty to companies and websites that cater to their needs by making something accessible. They will be the largest brand evangelists that you've ever encountered because of the fact that it's working for them, and they're so grateful that they're not having to struggle just to be able to do something that someone else does easily. And as a result of that, they have tremendous brand loyalty. Future value. It future-proofs the work to provide more value later on. We talked earlier about robust and the idea of flexible content. And so the idea of making something device independent, that content, regardless of what device it's rendered on, what viewport, that it still operates and it still functions and it still makes sense. This is future value that accessibility provides. So things for you to consider too when you're doing your job. Everything you do to make things work for someone that's blind or deaf helps with findability in SEO, because this is exactly the same kind of way that Google will crawl your site. So your search engine optimization, accessibility will benefit that. Everything that you do to make things work for someone who's low vision or mobility challenges actually helps with your mobile viewport. So low vision users have a need for proximity, and they struggle because they've expanded the viewport of the screen resolution so much that some things are off the viewport. And so low vision users are actually very much like mobile users. And so if you're looking at a responsive site and you want to make sure that it works on all these different breakpoints, low vision user needs actually meet many of the mobile user needs. And then finally, everything that you do to make things better for someone with cognitive difficulties really helps everyone. When you decide that your navigation is going to be predictable and consistent, that's great for everyone. When you decide that things are easier to find and that you're deciding that your error messaging will be a particular method of how you're going to present errors to your users and your customers, and you do it the same way regardless of which purchase path they go down, that's great for everyone. It's the same thing. The cost of delay. So there's a lot of really great analysis, and blackswanfarming.com talks about this, the cost of delay in a project. And one thing to consider about this is it's actually exponentially costly for delays with accessibility. This year, in January, we were working with a very large airline, and the goal was for us to be able to help them with accessibility at the design phase. They decided that they were going to delay in really focusing on accessibility until they were well into development. The project was a responsive booking engine, and it was meant to not only serve as the main revenue booking engine, but it was also going to lay out the patterns for everything they did afterwards. They had a project budget and timeline of 6 months, which is pretty aggressive at that level of what they're trying to accomplish, because it was brand new back end, brand new front end, totally responsive, and multiple teams across many different continents. We didn't actually start looking at accessibility until March, so there was a 2-month delay. They had already gone ahead and done design. They had already gone ahead and done some front-end development. As a result of that, it wasn't 2 months delayed. It's actually launching next month. So if you consider that, that was a 6-month delay, which is costly because of the fact that they waited in order to be able to incorporate accessibility into what they did. And so the cost of delay has a real impact when you're looking at putting accessibility at the end of that life cycle. That's invariably going to make your cost just go sky high. And this is why people look at accessibility as an expensive endeavor, because they wait too long to be able to put it into that process. But accessibility doesn't have to be an expensive endeavor. It has everything to do with the cost of delay. Finally, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the power of the web is its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. I kind of have to respect the guy who invented the internet as the person who really should be the voice that we listen to. And I think we understand that for all that it is, it's incredibly powerful, but for everything it is foremost a content mechanism of delivery and communication and interaction. It's about the information that you're getting or giving back and forth. So being able to make that fully accessible to everyone, again, feels like a human right to me. Because of this, I will tell you, and this is, again, years of doing this, accessibility makes Agile better. Whenever you're trying to convince an organization to adopt Agile, and not just in ceremony and name, and not just suddenly breaking apart into little mini waterfalls, right? But you're saying you really want them to embrace the concepts of Agile. People talk about it as an Agile transformation. This is a cultural mind shift to get a whole organization willing to embrace the principles of Agile. Accessibility actually can act as the catalyst for that. Because at the heart of it, the most important thing, the reason why we do things in an Agile way is not just because it's efficient. It's not just because it's productive, right? It's because ultimately there's value that you provide when you do things in an Agile way. And that value is very much connected to the end user. So people who are, like Master Yoda, very serious about Agile, and they're talking about this as if it is a religion, because it's a very serious philosophy, and you wouldn't be here at this conference if you didn't think about Agile in a regular way. So we have a Kanban board for our house, full disclosure. We use Jira at home. We had a Scrum method. We used Scrum and sprints to get our kid into college because there's way too much stuff to do, and it's time boxed, and we had to get that done. And so we embrace Agile in everything that we do, in absolutely everything we do, both at work and at home, because you start seeing how it can affect everything. But in the end, it's about people. So when people get really invested in Agile, it's not just because it works, but it's because you get to do your job and you feel really good about the idea that the customer is much more prevalent in an Agile project than any other kind of project. Accessibility is the purpose behind that. The idea that you're looking at every customer and knowing that you're prioritizing every customer. So it gives you meaning. So there's value that you get from Agile, but accessibility gives you meaning. And accessibility, therefore, really actually benefits Agile in so many ways. All right, Sprint 2 Retro. I think we're on target time-wise. Did you guys have any other questions about why? And I don't expect in this very limited time that I have made you all believers, although, again, you're here, So I have a feeling that you're probably already open to this idea that accessibility is important and that it's really about the how to be able to accomplish it in a way that doesn't blow up your project budget. But I am curious, is there anything else that you guys want to talk through? This is kind of a little bit different way of doing a retrospective. What questions can I answer?
How difficult are you finding to explain this move accessibility to the front end of the project, initially from companies or in companies approaching these accessibility challenges in the project?
So it depends on where the company is in their journey. Oftentimes, we will get frightened and anxious clients who come because they've gotten a letter or they've gotten a complaint and it has some legal piece behind it, and they'll be very uncomfortable. And so it's a different kind of conversation with those kinds of individuals, because if you put yourself in their position for a moment, they didn't ask for it. They have a different day job that they work at. They're having to completely trust an outside organization to help get them over this and enlighten them about everything. And there's a ticking clock waiting to judge them on something. So they feel frustrated, and they have to completely let themselves open to this to be able to work through this. Those kinds of clients we talk to, and it's a very different kind of conversation, because it's about building trust and it's about building communication, and they're already in a situation where they know they have to incorporate accessibility into what they're doing because they've gotten this pressure externally. And the real challenge with those kinds of clients is to not do the minimum, because it always becomes the maximum price-wise later on. And that's really a principle in anything having to do with web design and web development, that if you do the smallest piece of it without real attention to the whole, then you'll end up having to come back to it. And so then there's that whole cost of delay. So that's one group of people. Other people who want to be sort of convinced of the benefit of accessibility, there's a Jared Spool, I don't know if you guys know him, but he puts out wonderful user experience sort of week-long boot camps, and he basically has decided he will never build the business case for user experience ever again, because you either see the value or you don't, right? There's an old phrase like, what's the value of your mother, right? Like, some things are difficult to communicate into a cost balance sheet on paper. So there are things that we demonstrate and we can talk to, and we usually can't give someone a generic sort of, this is how to build the business case for accessibility, because it's very specific to what your business's goals are as to what those key indicators and the return on investment might be. So if you're a web shop and you have your development lifecycle completely buttoned up and you don't have any problems with quality of your code, what we talk to you about is something different than if we're talking to an organization that has an 8-year-old e-commerce application, because accessibility can benefit both of those organizations, but very differently. So there is a piece of it that will give someone the data, but in the end, they have to understand that it's their customers that we're trying to help them appeal to, you know, and that's really either they get it or they don't at that point.
I'm wondering about your experience while trying to sell or make people conscious of the importance of accessibility. If it's useful to work in a previous user experience, or perhaps the customer is thinking of user experience previously to accessibility. Because on the bottom line of that, they are trying to access more users, but perhaps they are not thinking of that little 15 people.
Yeah.
But trying to make more accessible content in terms of how the information is structured or whatever. I don't know if you you try to communicate or to find companies doing the user experience effort previously to this accessibility effort easier to sell.
Yes. In short, yes. So the question, I believe, is whether or not it is easier to really kind of bring somebody into the understanding about why accessibility is important if they've already invested some time and effort in user experience. I think that's kind of, or
Is that I feel for customers that some user experience is somehow more important, or they realize is more important, although it has included the accessibility bit, but
mhm.
what they see is user experience, evaluated customer, but not thinking on the minority, but thinking on the global. But if they buy this concept of user experience or improving
Yes.
user experience, at the end, this comes attached.
Yeah, it is. And it is true that a lot of what you do for best practices for user experience is something that benefits accessibility. So people who are champions for the user are already doing some accessibility in what they do. They don't understand maybe all the details, but when you're really good at your job, even if you're a web developer, if you're really good at your job, you're actually helping people with disabilities. You just may not know it, and you may not have done everything that you could do, right? So yes, the answer is definitely the more customer and user focused that people are, the easier it is for them to understand, because ultimately this is about a human experience. So it's about the whether or not they can do it at a cost. So that brings us to sprint 3. Let me check and see where I'm at with timing. Yes. All right, sprint 3, how do I do lean accessibility? This is that thing I was telling you that's like an 8-hour workshop. There are things yesterday that I just had to cut and cut and cut and cut. But the good news is there's going to be some stuff online that I'm publishing, and there's a book early next year that will also be coming out entitled Lean Accessibility that goes into much more detail. So this is a very high-level way of unpacking it by role. And so let's dive in. Some guiding principles to keep in mind. So if you're agile-minded, not just someone who goes to stand-ups and goes through the motions and talks about a backlog but really doesn't understand the purpose behind it, or just writes out stories without thinking about something. But if you're truly agile-minded, the idea is it's experimentation and continuous learning and improvements that create a better online experience for users. So lean accessibility is experimentation and continuous learning and improvements that creates a better online experience for all users. That's really essentially what we're talking about doing. So, full disclosure, this is not a magic bullet. There will be no absolute epiphanies for you. Some of this, if it's a good thing, really. If you say, of course, absolutely, I know this, right? That's a good thing. That means that you're well on the path to success. So, but after today, you should, let's talk about what we're hoping to accomplish. Bravely begin your accessibility journey if you haven't. Find a way. If you're at this conference, you understand the value of small improvements that create measurable change. So small improvements with regards to accessibility is success, and you just keep iterating off of that. You may witness measurable improvement. You may already be doing some accessibility in what you do, and you want to actually start putting something together and then, do a little bit of a retrospective and say, did this actually increase my costs? Did this, improve the value of what it is I'm doing? And see how you're doing. For some of you guys, you may find your moonshot moment, and you may find it be something that happens and you'll be able to point back to this conference. I won't say that it was me, but this conference about the idea of when you're able to do this. A moonshot moment, Google has talked about it before, but basically this is a quote from John F. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. A moonshot moment means you decide that because it is hard, there is much to do with it, much to invest, but so much to gain that it's a game-changing kind of outcome. And sometimes there are those opportunities where you'll find, like Elon Musk, for example, where you just decide, we're going to go to Mars. This is what we're going to do. So really it should be like a Mars shot moment now, I guess. But the idea is that you do something bold, because innovation doesn't happen when you do these small, tiny little changes and improvements. When you improve 15% of your product, you are not changing the game. When you decide you're going to try something bold and entirely different, you will probably fail, but then you will also perhaps succeed, and you will change history as a result of it. Some people, accessibility can be that for them. So, lean accessibility by role. There are others, but we don't really have a whole lot of time to go through them. I'll talk a little bit about product owners and how to incorporate accessibility into what you do. UX and design leads, usability testers, developers, QA testers, procurement officers, very briefly, and all the things, meaning mostly about process. All right, here we go. Product owners. Is anyone here in that role as a product owner? Do you know someone or work with someone who's a product owner? It's probably, yeah, I'm hoping, right? If you say that you work with a digital project manager, talk to me outside and we'll have a discussion about that. So product owners, this is something to help them with. All right, so here's some guidelines for inclusive design and lean accessibility. There are 2 kinds of stories that you need to write, just 2 from an accessibility point of view. There are 3 kinds of requirements that you need to define with regards to accessibility. And there are no sleepless nights that you should have because of lean accessibility. You will be doing it wrong if this consumes you and you're working 12-hour days because you've decided to incorporate accessibility into what you do. I say this because a lot of people try and they work very hard, but they don't work very smart because they don't understand maybe ways that they can approach this. So, stories. Stories are the result of a shared understanding of the need and the solution and the value for the user. The reason why I say that is because sometimes we get into sort of rote, automatic behavior on an agile team. And a shared understanding really does mean that that story is a document that represents some kind of conversation, an interaction, a collaboration that you've had as a team. It is not, they are not, newspaper delivery, drive-by messages, secret clues left for a team to interpret. They're not something you throw over the fence as a product owner and that you expect every bit of detail in that story should prevent someone from making a mistake and not interpreting it. You know that you're not doing it correctly with writing stories if the stories are basically like a business requirements document. If you have to put that much information into your story, it's an indication that you haven't been working collaboratively with your team enough to have a shared understanding. That should be a reference document for a conversation that that developer and that designer has already had with a product owner. So, with that said, there are really 2 kinds of stories, like I said before. Stories that are specifically about accessibility are about the need, the solution, and the value. So here's an example, and we call this remediation. It means fixing something that's broken, right? Fixing something that's inaccessible. There's a problem on our homepage. This is not really in story format traditionally, but we break rules with Agile. There is a problem on our homepage with the embedded Twitter feed, and it's making keyboard users get stuck in the iframe without the ability to do other things on our website. So you guys have seen these embedded Twitter feeds, and sometimes, many times, 90% of the time, I would say, that's a made-up statistic, but very often they have something called a keyboard trap. If you navigate into them with your keyboard, you can't get out of them. And for us, it's annoying, and we take our mouse and we click somewhere else. For a keyboard user, that basically means that they have to reload the entire web page and start over. Or, more likely, they'll go somewhere else to get that information or complete that purchase. So the need is about accessibility. The solution is about how to fix this for accessibility. The value for the user is at least accessibility. It might also be good for somebody else as well, because then you've decided if somebody did tap into that, that they're not also getting stuck in this. So that's an accessibility story, only to be used for remediation. All other stories as a product owner that are written are about accessibility is really part of the solution and the value. The need is about whatever the story is about. So there's no such thing as an accessibility story that accompanies a new feature. Not only will it, I speak from painful experience, double your project budget, or 6 times over put 6, 7, 8 stories for every one regular story you have. It completely separates the accessibility need and requirements from the other story. So you really only need one kind of accessibility story, and that's to fix an accessibility problem. Any other story, accessibility is really just part of that solution. So another way to look at this, if it was a brand new feature, my happy new feature story, I want a Twitter feed on our homepage that allows our users to read all the latest tweets that we post in real time, so they'll buy more cool stuff from us. The need is about a Twitter feed, right? It's not specifically about accessibility. The solution is all the stuff that goes into being able to create that, plus the accessibility solution that's needed for that, the requirements. And the value is all kinds of stuff and accessibility. Does that make sense to everybody? Good, awesome. Let's talk about requirements. There are 3 categories of accessibility requirements. I put them in persona world so that you can think about them that way. There's the surly teenager who's rolling her eyes at you and thinks it's absolutely stupid that we asked this question. So stuff everyone should know. That's just about doing your job, whether your job is a designer or developer or tester. Then there's timeless best practices. So this nice little old lady who's been around forever, who gives you the kinds of answers that you seek. They're always the same answers, but they're always great. And then we're what we call snowflakes, where that's if it's something very specific to what you're building, and it's something very detail-oriented that is different than the everyday kinds of requirements. So let's see how this pans out. You want to build a modal dialogue. And so I have an example of one, right? So this is going to be the story that you would write. I want to build a modal dialogue. The 3 different kinds of requirements for accessibility for that. So the surly teenager, this is the stuff everybody should know, right? So that zip code field should have a label. We'll go back to it for a second. You see enter zip code with the text field? So a developer, every developer should know that if you have a form field, it needs a label for attribute with it. That's doing your job as a developer. It may mean that you have to do a better job as a developer, but this is not brand new information. Every developer should know, build valid code, right? So that's that group of requirements. The second are things that are specific to accessibility, but it won't change depending on what kind of modal dialogue you're building. An example is use the escape key, and it should close that modal dialogue. That's going to be true for every single modal dialogue that you ever build. It doesn't matter what it looks like, doesn't matter the content inside of it. If I use the escape key, it should close it. And then the third kind would be, this is the snowflake stuff. When you close this dialogue, the focus should go back to some very specific location, whatever initiated it, right? But it's a very specific location. That's very specific to that story. That's a snowflake requirement. So how much of these need to go into the story? It's not a trick question. The truth is, how much of these do you normally put in your stories? Hopefully not any, right? Hopefully the idea is that you don't have to tell a developer how to do his or her job. You know and trust that they know their craft, and they understand that if it looks like a button and it acts like a button, don't make it a span, right? I mean, there's some basics like that, you think. But this is the basic stuff, right? This is usually something, I think I have a slide for it, yeah. Usually something that's in some sort of knowledge wiki, like the happy user guide to accessible modal dialogues, and it's in your, let's hope not SharePoint, it's in your Confluence, right? And so you can go there and somebody can read some of those obvious requirements for accessibility that they may not know, but it's something you can point to every time, and you don't have to constantly be rewriting these things in every story, because every modal dialogue should have the escape key. And then the last part are unique story requirements. When you close the dialogue, the focus should go back to. This is what should be in the story. This is likely to be something that you link to, that you don't have to rewrite. And this is something you shouldn't have to reference, and it's something that will come out as that painful, awkward conversation afterwards in testing about why didn't you do something that is something that every developer should do. And this, ultimately, is something, in theory, that you can build out as a pattern. And once that is in a pattern library or a design system, then you're referencing the modal dialogue that is for your company that you use. So this makes story writing for accessibility requirements a lot more straightforward, a lot easier for product owners. UX and design leads. Any UX and design leads? Yay! There's always one, yes. All right. 5 principles of inclusive design, which will sound very familiar to everything you already do. Obvious wins. Call it what it is. Make it simple, make it easy. Make it consistent, make it predictable. Change your perspective and assume nothing. And finally, go see, or in agile terms, Gemba. So, obvious wins. Oh, the hamburger menu. Who knew we would be talking every single day about hamburgers from this point on, right? Or the pancake. Somebody once tried to call it that when it first came out. This is a legacy of Facebook experimenting and the whole world taking it over as, well, surely they've tested this with people. And they hadn't. So this hamburger menu, I'm assuming that everybody's familiar with what this is. It's the mobile icon for navigation menu, right? This has gone through usability testing. And it continues to go through usability testing. Luke Wroblewski has commented on this many times because I think it's very interesting, because people get stuck on ideas like image carousels must be good, right? Because everybody has one. Hamburger menus actually test very poorly with usability testing. And it's because many people actually outside of our professions don't know what this is supposed to do. And even if they use it one time, it doesn't mean that it acts predictably enough for them to understand. And sometimes people don't use the pattern specifically for a menu. They use it for many things, like a login. And so they found that when they did usability testing, they had 3 separate scenarios. They had the icon, they had just the word menu, and then they had the icon with the word menu. And what tested best was the icon with the word menu, because it's obvious, and obvious wins every time. Make it simple. This is on our website. We have some examples on examples.simplyaccessible.com. And this is a well-tested, often used set of patterns for forms and validation and error messaging. And there are pieces to this that make recovering from errors much easier, much more simple for people, and not just people with disabilities. It could also be people who are, again, non-native speakers of that language, or it could be people who are new to technology. But how you recover from errors as a customer defines your relationship with that company from that point on. So if you look at it, there's an error summary bucket at the top. These are just best practices, right? But this is simple. The following 3 items require your attention. The idea that you're giving somebody the exact number of how many problems there are on the site, and then having these links in that bulleted list means that if I were to select, please provide a first name, and I hit that first name hyperlink, I actually go to the text field to fix the problem. That's as simple as it gets for people, because then they don't have to tab through, which might be a painful experience for some people. They don't have to tab through all of these things in order to get to that problem. They also know they're in the right place to fix the problem. They don't have to guess and figure out first name, is this where I should be, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things on this form for error messaging, and specifically when it comes to error messaging, making it simple is always going to be the more accessible solution. Make it consistent. So along with keyboard accessibility, the other thing that we talk about practically like a mantra is about pattern libraries and design systems. The biggest problem that people have in maintaining code, Oracle said that 80% of the lifetime of code is spent in maintaining someone else's code, not building something, but maintaining it. And it's because there are these unique ways that someone has decided to build something, and then they hand it off to someone else, and they have to forensically recreate whatever was happening, and they dive in, and they have to first understand it, and then they have to go ahead and try and figure out a way to be able to extend the lifetime of that. If, on the other hand, you create a design system, you have examples as to what's working, you have versioning, and you have something that requires much less work for people because they're only pulling from that modal dialogue that's already been vetted, it's already been tested, it's already something that you know matches with the brand, and it matches with whatever the user experience and research has shown is a consistent user pattern. So pattern libraries always. So assume nothing. I have a set of cards here that I'll hand out to you guys later that we're handing to people. This is a picture of the company owner. He teaches all across the world, and he has something he does, it's called the straw test, where he has everyone put their hands up to their eye and they create a straw, like not a big milkshake straw, but like a coffee stirrer straw. And he has them go through on the screen a web page, and he watches, and they have to go ahead and move through these kinds of experiences in a somewhat simulated way of being someone with low vision, because they only have a little pinprick that they can actually see the website with. And the idea from a user experience point of view is you cannot, and this is something that every UX person would tell you that they know as well, you cannot assume that someone is experiencing your website in the way that you built it. Not everybody has these giant Thunderbolt displays. Not everybody has all of the kinds of, high retina imagery enabled. And so you assume nothing and you experience it very differently, and you put some design constraints together. So this is an example of the card. Like I said, I have this and a couple of others I'd love to give to you guys. And it basically has a hole punch in it, and you complete an interaction while looking through the hole in this card. So you basically put yourself through a few simulated exercises to see what would this be like if I had to do this. Another one is if you navigated just using the headings. Like you couldn't read any of the other content on the page, but just the headings. Do you know where to go? Do you know what action to take? And then finally, go see. So we did some usability testing last year and found something pretty remarkable that has changed over the last couple of years. We do a lot of remote facilitated usability testing with people with disabilities. That's a big phrase. And what really provides benefit for us is the fact that we're able to actually hear people's reactions and see what the actions they're taking. So I definitely recommend it over unmoderated testing, because you don't know if somebody stops in that particular flow. You don't know why. You're hoping they'll share with you, but if they're a person with disabilities, there may be reasons they don't even understand why they weren't able to continue. So this has been blurred out to protect the not-so-innocent, one of our clients. And we found something very interesting. Most of our clients that we're working with have responsive websites, or adaptive, or some pages are responsive. And so we're recognizing that they're looking at different ways of being able to have the different breakpoints, have a mobile view, and so at certain resolutions that'll happen. We found that in doing usability testing, we took some screenshots, and this is really that same idea of you don't know how your customers are accessing your site and what they're looking at. This is someone with low vision, and I think this was Amanda, and she uses not only JAWS screen reader, but she also zooms and magnifies in. But you can see that she's got the bookmarks bar over here, and so that changes the whole viewport, and it made it go into a mobile view because of that. So she's on a desktop, but it gave a mobile view. Another one is somebody purposely sized the screen to be something that they can navigate in. It's very different from what you would expect. So all this beautiful Hebrew imagery that you've created on your site, beautiful, but not everybody's going to necessarily encounter it that way. And then finally, this was the most revealing. There are a fair group, a number of people who are screen reader users who don't have a monitor connected to their computer. They don't need a monitor. They're not using that part of the computer. The problem is Windows throws it into this 150 pixel by 150 pixel screen resolution, which means that non-sighted blind user with a desktop screen reader is actually accessing the mobile site because it's automatically reduced it and given you the mobile layout. So nobody ever thought, really, to test JAWS, which is a desktop application, with a mobile viewport. Why would we? Because we assumed that person would probably be on their iPhone, and there's a screen reader built in here. So this is what we had always been testing with for anything that was a mobile viewport. But we've learned, again, this is even our education, that recognizing that because of everything that's happening with responsive and different people who are using these different devices, there's no way to tell what someone is using unless you go see. All right, usability testers. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. One of the things that we like to do is use personas. Our personas are not the disabled person persona, because that would be like having a fax manager, right? Because in the end, everybody might have some kind of disability. But we incorporate that into what we do when we're building personas. Likewise, when we're doing usability testing, a lot of people are challenged because in web projects you have lots of different phases that you want to get that user feedback, but you can't exactly use a wireframe and talk to somebody with a screen reader. They're not going to be able to provide you any kind of feedback on that because it's not in a format that they can understand and digest with a screen reader. So what we did was we mapped this out. Typically, most people are saying, who is my primary user? Who is my secondary user? And there may be lots and lots of people who use your site, but you come up with these sort of proto-personas that you use. And so what we did was we created this for a specific roles within the different usability testing and to cater to certain roles within UX. So for the information architect or content strategist, your primary user is a neurally diverse user, meaning somebody who might have cognitive challenges, or they might have a learning disability, or they might be someone who's aging into dementia, or it might be somebody who's a non-native English speaker. Or we say neurally diverse because a lot of people with autism are not disabled. What they are is prevented from being able to access content in the way they prefer. The secondary user would be a non-native language speaker. So conduct usability testing with paper prototypes and sketches. People who are neurally diverse or non-native language speakers of whatever it is that you're building, they're able to provide you feedback on the information architecture, about the site hierarchy, about the navigation. And so it's great to use paper prototypes and sketches and low-fidelity wireframes at this stage with these individuals. For the visual designer, your primary user would be a low-vision user, and your secondary user would be a colorblind user. These are two areas that particularly are important for people who are visual designers. You need to know from a low vision user whether or not the designs that you're building and the layouts that you're creating are something that are going to cause problems, particularly with proximity. If you have a form here and the actual completion button is far flung way off in the corner, it's very likely that someone with low vision will never see that button, and they'll be cruising around on the site and they won't be able to find it. So conduct usability testing with high fidelity mockups. You can use Axure or Balsamic or Photoshop or PDFs in order to be able to get feedback from low vision users. And colorblind users will always be able to tell you whether or not you're using color in order to convey some sort of meaning and take an action. Because if they aren't able to see the difference between that red and that green, and you're using it to define a change in state or behavior, they will be able to give you that feedback. Inclusive persona mapping for the interaction designer. Your primary user are people with mobility challenges, partly because of what we talked about before, being the largest group of people with disabilities, but also because interaction designers need to understand how somebody completes a task, and they need to know how a person obviously interacts with it. And then your secondary user would be blind users, and those are both very similar. They're mapped together. They're slightly different. They're both keyboard users most of the time, but blind users have a very specific set of needs in addition to just being a keyboard user. They need to know if something is visually conveyed, that it's also something that they can get through screen reader access, which is generally a text equivalent. So you can conduct usability testing with these individuals when you've got HTML prototypes after you've done some QA on it and make sure that it is actually keyboard accessible. So this is a benefit because it means that you can involve people at every stage of the project lifecycle. Okay, developers. The developer list is going to look really short and it may be disappointing, but the truth is this is all you need to succeed, and I'm not kidding. So, test-driven development, we had a great keynote earlier about this, and this is something that we are huge fans of. This will definitely speed up your work with accessibility. If you create tests, you will know automatically early on the same reason why tests are, it's cheap to fail early and it's more costly to fail later on. It's the same thing. So we encourage developers, if they haven't already, to really incorporate test-driven development into what they do. There's a lot of automated tools out there. The automated tools capture only about 25% of accessibility issues. With that said, it's 25% that you can catch. And you want to be able to do it at your local dev environment so that you'll be able to run a test, understand the problem, so that by the time you commit code, it's something that you've already resolved. The best assistive technology for developers to use to test their work is free, and it's awesome. Like science, web standards exist whether you believe in them or not. That's the truth. Neil deGrasse Tyson said it. Who gets to be able to do a mic drop saying this is gravity? It's pretty cool. Your web standards are the golden rule for being able to create something that is more accessible. So instead of creating a span and finding a way to take script and be able to actually make that thing like a hyperlink, make it a hyperlink. That's what HTML was for. There's real benefit with progressive enhancement. And know that it's out of fashion now and people don't talk about it a lot, but progressive enhancement is valuable. The idea that you're solving the problems at the lowest point in the stack, it's always going to help you for maintaining that code later. And if you have valid code, if you use web standards, you're doing the next person who does have to maintain that code a huge favor, and they may send you a cake. So that assistive technology that I was talking about, the best thing in the world is your keyboard. Every developer has a keyboard at his or her desk. If you test your code with a keyboard and make it pristine and know that you can operate and get into interactions and get out of interactions, and that there's not something that only happens on hover but also can be selected with a keyboard, this is the best way to ensure that your code is accessible. There's other complex things. There's dynamic feedback, there's AJAX calls, there might be focus path management that you need to work through. But 70%, we did a survey of the years of work that we've been doing in Jira, and we put a label on any issue that we had logged with a client that was actually related to web standards. Remember that first category of requirements, the whole do your job, right? 70% of the issues that we log go directly back to web standards. So that's an important piece. Keyboard accessibility is actually a part of web standards. The reason why something is not keyboard accessible or does not read aloud the same way for JAWS as it does for NVDA or VoiceOver is not because it's quirky. I promise. It's not because it's quirky. It's because somebody decided to take a non-standard way to solve a problem. And the less standardized your code is, the more likely assistive technology doesn't know what to do with it. And then finally, this is available either as a Chrome extension or a Firefox add-on. The Web Developer Toolbar is not specifically for accessibility, but it is enormously helpful if you want to look at specific things. It has things like being able to view the document outline. One caveat is it actually does read the DOM, so you might have multiple different headings on there. It also allows you to disable images and see what it looks like without images. It allows you to show the alternate text on those images. It allows you to be able to go through a lot of these different pieces and really debug things at a manual level and look through that. And it's free and it's at the browser level. It's very easy to use, and our team members use it. We spend a lot of time in source code. And one of the things that helps us is these kind of quick hits for this. And it's not a dumbed down tool. It's pretty sophisticated and it's free. So when you get to that point where you're doing all these things right, one of the things that we can say with developers is that you can start really solving problems and getting creative. And innovation often happens at that design and development level when you've already started mastering how to do things in an accessible way, but you want to find a better way to accomplish it. There's a requirement with accessibility that says that we need to be able to provide a mechanism to skip repetitive content. Specifically, when you have a big menu at the top, and that menu may have 10 or 40, or we hope not, but could have 100 links in the mega menu navigation. That's okay. As a visual user, you understand that it's there when you go to the website the first time, and then you kind of cruise past that and you go to something else. But if you're a keyboard-only user, you have no other mechanism unless it's provided but to tab through all of those links every single time. And that can be not only laborious and tedious, but actually painful for some keyboard-only users. So the requirement is to skip this. And this requirement was put out there a long time ago. So a very popular way to solve it is skip to main content. The problem with that is that skipping to the main content is really kind of ambiguous about where that's supposed to take a user. It also looks kind of ugly. And the other thing is it doesn't really help people understand where they're going, right? They don't know what is the main content. Is it the heading level 1? Or is it the main beginning div on the page? Where are you sending that person? And every website is a little different. And so people stop trusting it, and they don't use that. So in 2012, we worked on something called a table of contents, and you can see it on our website. And basically, it's a pretty simple, progressively enhanced method, and it says what's on this page. And it dynamically pulls from JavaScript, using JavaScript, it pulls the headings on the page and creates a table of contents. Because that's what people really want. They really want to be able to get a quick overview, the way visual users have, to be able to know what could they maybe jump to as far as content. Since that time, LinkedIn has used the same mechanism. We showed them how, and they've improved it on our work. And PayPal has also used it. And so this is a new method of thinking about how to be able to provide that. And the great thing is, it's not just good for some people, it's good for everyone. And it's great for being able to understand at a quick glance what is on that page. And so it's something to consider that you're able to move into things and solve problems in a very creative way when you really master those foundational pieces of accessibility. Okay, QA testers. Has anybody ever seen this image before? Maybe you can tell me, why is this not agile? It's not agile. What's that? Yeah, exactly right. There's no minimum viable product in this, right? The idea is you get a wheel. What good is a wheel? I've given you all the back-end functionality this sprint. Next sprint, I will give you the UI that will allow you to know whether or not that back-end functionality actually works, right? Business stakeholders don't like that because it's not viable. So the idea is that you have to wait to the very end to get something that's truly usable, right? So the real value of a minimum viable product is we give you something useful and we continue to iterate off of it and make it better and better and better and better. But from the very beginning, it's valuable. So accessibility in a traditional sense, people will say it's all included. Every requirement must be met. And I absolutely agree. in principle that in order to make something accessible, it must be fully accessible, or you leave somebody out. With that said, we're living in the real world, and it takes a while sometimes to make a website fully accessible. So instead of saying we're going to have an accessibility project and we're going to invest 4 months and do nothing but accessibility, and you basically are making your customers with disabilities wait a year before they ever see one thing on the website, we came up with something and have tested it over the last year and a half with great success. And this is lean accessibility testing as a minimum viable product. And the idea is you start with something and you get this solid and you release it. Then you go to the next thing, you get that solid, then you release it, and you keep going. And eventually, right, you make it fully accessible. But we talked before about keyboard accessibility being the number one thing that you should always make sure that you prioritize because it impacts the most users on your site. So go through and make your keyboard accessibility the highest priority and get that released. And that actually provides tremendous value early on, and that is an agile concept. Valid code is another piece of that. And so we broke it down into these things, and we've even simplified it to something that we call KIF, which is keyboard, images, and forms. Because even though they represent about 30% of the accessibility requirements in WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they impact as much as about 70% of users. And so recognizing that there's a smaller investment for larger gain, that's absolutely in line with an agile principle of producing value early on. So, who benefits from lean accessibility testing? People with mobility issues who rely on the keyboard or other alternative input devices. People who rely on assistive technology for any reason. People who turn off images or need more contrast on web pages. People who have difficulty using headings or forms because of cognitive, learning, language, or attention issues. If you make sure that your keyboard and images and forms are all really accessible, you have accomplished so much on your site and you've learned so much, and you're much smarter the next time that you go into that, then you find yourself in a position where you've got this momentum also because you're providing the value and showing the benefits of it. I am not able to do a full thing on procurement, and it sounds weird to put this in here, but how many of you guys have third-party applications or work with vendor teams or have any kind of software that you didn't build yourself that you have to incorporate? Pretty much everybody, right? And yet, it's like the components of baking a cake. When you hand that cake to your customers, they don't know that the eggs were actually sourced from one person and that the flour is actually a different company and that the milk is not really yours, it's actually the neighbor's cow down the street. What they see is the cake, and that's your cake. So that Twitter feed, they're not going to say, well, I understand that that's really something you brought in, or I know that you're using jQuery for this, so I'm not going to hold you accountable for that. It's all the same thing to the end user. So it's really important to consider things like procurement because you inherit any issues. So there is actually an agile procurement toolkit. And I'm just going to list this here because it's important, time boxing. But this is steps to happier digital governance. So I don't know how many of you guys work with people who do buying of software and arranging contracts with vendors, but they're usually not the most agile people. I don't know, but they're not usually the people who are putting a Kanban board for how to do chores in the house and stuff like that. With that said, everything that we recommend is something that can fit within Agile, so it kind of teaches them agile-minded thinking, a little bit like putting the vegetables in the lasagna. Scoping, taking an inventory of the vendors. Acceptance criteria, we have specific things on requests for proposal language to include. Minimum viable product, vendor self-assessments. The idea of having, if you're going to incorporate and purchase an employee benefits application or payroll, and you don't want to inherit accessibility problems, then you're looking at 3 different ones. Have them first give you their assessment of how accessible something is. It's not going to be perfect, but again, like the minimum viable product we saw, it's a skateboard, and you don't then have to go and fully test all of these different applications. Then testing it. So the idea of testing in Agile is about understanding and testing out the viability of something and then learning from that, right? And it's usually an iterative process. Having live vendor interviews is the same concept, is being able to have this iterative process where you have ongoing discussions to determine the viability of whether or not this vendor is able to meet your needs from accessibility. We have some sample questions too for that to be able to help. And they're, tough questions, but they should be. If you're giving someone your money, they should make good use of that. And then iterative improvements. Once you've pulled all this together, you have a pretty clear idea, and usually even the best of applications are not fully accessible, but you have an idea of the gaps. And so putting compliance timelines around that, it's important, right? Put that into the contract and be able to have that as these are the iterative improvements that will happen to this application or this software. And then the done-when criteria, you know that you can close the metaphorical story when you have contract language that includes all of this information in there, because then it holds them accountable. Even after they've made the sale, they know, just as anyone would, they understand, they have a shared understanding of what the requirements are and how to be successful. So I'm not allowed to go further than that. But I don't know, for some reason I really like talking with people about procurement, I think because so much of what we do as a team is we interact with a client, but then there's 18 vendors and this white label software and this particular scripting library, and it's the thing that nobody really talks about is that most websites are built of many different pieces and parts, and you shouldn't be responsible for something that you yourself didn't build. So how do you get that shared responsibility? All the things. So this is mostly about process. So decisions to make when you're looking at process and thinking about accessibility. Do you want to create your own accessibility standards, or do you want to purely look at what is externally defined? That's an important decision, and it's obviously not something that you have to stick with and never change your mind ever, but you need to know what are your standards going to be. Most people start with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and then if they have a very robust user experience team, or they do a lot of usability testing, or they're very invested in their product, they start building their own internal requirements on top of that are more specific to their organization or their product. Because ultimately, you know your customers, and so you will know what things might be causing barriers, and so you may want to build on that. And then the second question, and this is really a big question that large-scale organizations have to deal with all the time. What will you remediate and what will you redesign? Because there's always projects in flight, and honestly, it is not worth it to remediate something if you know you're about to build this all out in Angular 2. Then let's invest in your team understanding how to build an accessible Angular 2 application instead of going back to this legacy, code that may not be around in 3 months. And then there's a couple of different ways to approach this, and it's very similar to Agile transformation. When you see people who are adopting Agile, there's 2 ways to do it. One is to have sort of an organizational approach, and you allow teams to sort of self-organize and define how they will incorporate Agile into what they do, and it's sort of that minimum viable product level, and it's across the whole organization. Accessibility is the same way. You could say, we're all going to focus on keyboard accessibility as an organization, and we're not going to focus on all the other things. And that has moderate appeal, but usually I have found, at least in my experience, it doesn't actually transform anything, both from an Agile perspective as well as accessibility. If you approach it kind of shallow but wide, you don't usually get the kind of buy-in and the emotional investment that you need for either Agile or accessibility. If you take a nucleus pilot and you basically narrow your scope but go very deep with it, and you say, we're going to take our mobile team and we're going to make them and transform them into an Agile project team, right? An agile product team. That always has more success, in my experience, than saying everybody kind of does a little bit of agile, right? Is to have somebody really become evangelists for agile. And so accessibility is the same way. If you decide that you want to take a new product that you're developing and you take that as your pilot and you decide accessibility is important in this one project, and I'm not going to worry about all the other flagship stuff that's there, not yet, we're going to invest that, then you get all these lessons learned in this way of being able to bring it outward. So this is typically the old-fashioned way that people look at accessibility, is they have like, a little office in the basement, and they have the big red phone, and people call and say, "Oh my gosh, I need you." And they're like, 1-800-accessibility, may I help you? Or it's very siloed, and people don't talk to each other, and this is not successful in the same way that this is not successful for businesses, and it's not successful when businesses are trying to do things in an agile and cost-efficient way. It's the same thing. Here's an example of an iterative, agile, inclusive process. So recognizing that you can't probably staff a full-time accessibility person on every product team that you have, nor should you. But what you probably can do is create a team of accessibility mentors who work very directly with these project teams at different key points during a sprint and during a project life cycle. And so this is a very simplified process map, really, because I'm sure there's lots of staging environments and different kinds of things. There's lots of dotted arrows and lines that go back and forth. But this gives you a general idea, and we typically work with teams to figure out what their process is and where accessibility integrates within that. So in the story writing and backlog grooming, it's absolutely essential to have accessibility there, because in that modal dialogue conversation, if you don't have the requirements of what it takes to be able to build an accessible modal dialogue, a developer will say, that's 3 story points. And then you will come back to them and say, well, it's not accessible for all these reasons that I actually didn't define earlier. And they say, well, that's going to change the project scope, and now the release is at risk. And this is all accessibility's fault. This is a true story. The truth is that that developer may have estimated differently if he or she knew this is actually what it's going to require in order for you to be able to build an accessible modal dialogue. And they say, well, that's a lot different. That's 8 story points. And then the next time, maybe it's 5. And then the next time, maybe it is 3 story points, because they get comfortable with it. So during the story writing and backlog grooming, it's really important to get accessibility expertise in there so that you know of those 3 categories of requirements, what will it take to be able to make this successful and accessible. I'm going to assume that everybody has a pattern library. No. Everybody has some form, and everyone is moving towards that aspirationally, but you have something that you're reusing. So as it's becoming this beautiful, robust pattern library, usability, automated testing, and user research, all of that then feeds into the pattern library, which then helps with story writing and backlog grooming. Then accessibility is really helpful to have that expertise during sprint planning for exactly that reason. So if somebody says, I don't understand these requirements, can you explain to me what I need to be able to do? Having somebody there during sprint planning is useful, because then everyone has a really clear idea about what it'll take. Then there's, of course, all the iterative stuff that happens within the regular sprint, and having someone there that's really more on a consulting basis that's supporting the UX and the testing and the development during that sprint. And then, of course, release when ready is preferred, and then having automated testing in a sort of a bookended way and having it there is also useful. This is, like I said, very simple. It's not... I'm going to go through this. We have 5 minutes. It's so sad. Okay, pattern all the things. Yes! So pattern library, quick definition. I'm going to go through and say some pattern library features. They should be live code. It's not a pattern library if it's a PDF. It's a style guide, which is a great idea for when you build your pattern library, but it's not the same. Downloadable assets. Really make this as easy as possible for people. Each pattern should have a status. It's really useful if you're going to make this something that's truly agile. You want to be able to have something that people can understand. If this was gone through usability testing, if this is something that you're using on all these other sites, if it's experimental, it's really okay to have something experimental as a pattern, but you want to be able to show that. Each pattern should have versioning so that people can subscribe to it and understand when that pattern has been updated. Yep, new information is added. Okay. Here's some great pattern library examples. The Web Experience Toolkit from the Government of Canada was built in order to be able to make government websites more accessible. It's mostly like a WordPress, Drupal, slightly bootstrap kind of framework, but it's useful to see how they've done that. BBC Global Experience Language, they're on, I believe, version 2, maybe version 3. They're one of the largest companies who's invested the most in usability and inclusive design. They've done a tremendous amount of usability testing, and they think very heavily about inclusive design because of the nature of their business. And so they have a really exhaustive framework and resource, and a lot of that is available for people to see. Code for America was a recent iteration of something to try and take the idea of a pattern library and make it more applicable to large businesses, particularly for government organizations in the United States. And then Fractal is a framework. Another one would be Pattern Lab is also useful. Those are helpful in order to be able to think in terms of a living pattern library. So pattern library is a product, so have a team to support it. Pattern library is a product. Don't make people do this on their off time, because then it will always fall out of sync. Better, easier pattern libraries are true north. Always make that really something that's sacred text for your organization, that the pattern library defines for the business what should be done for this interaction. They should be technical enough to provide implementation information that developers need, but not so technical that they exclude everyone. Sometimes pattern libraries only appeal to developers, and that locks everyone out of the process. It should be a living design system, so it's going to have to evolve as your brand evolves. And then you must have some process for managing change. The same way that you do with any other kind of product, you want to be able to have that in place. All right, Sprint 3 Retro. I went too long. Any questions about that? There's a lot of information. Now you see why it's a full day thing. But it's useful, I think, to maybe give you guys a bit of an overview. I hear nothing. Okay. So a final word about scalability. As you're thinking about, this works great in a small space, how do I make this work in a larger space? Jeff Gotha, the writer of the Lean UX book that many of us kind of keep on hand, said something I think is tremendously useful. Scale principles, not process. And that's something that applies to accessibility. It also applies to Agile. So when you're thinking about Agile, don't get so wrapped around the details that it drives you to slow down what you're doing because of the process needing to scale. Think in terms of the principles instead. Because process will get you those short-term gains, but process will always need to evolve and change, whereas principles will get you that long-term change that you're looking for. So I've given you all of maybe 90 seconds. Not great. But yes, hi.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
In your experience, who's I mean, I wouldn't like to call it a Frank Sinatra of accessibility websites, just to have a, but it's obviously not in everyone's agenda.
Right.
Who's a good reference?
Who is a good reference? This is a very common question, and it's tough because websites are living. I think that there are many organizations that have moments of brilliance when it comes to accessibility, but the only one obviously that I could vet for would be our website, because I know the developers. It's not a pitch. I'm just telling you, I just happen to know it's what we do, so it is accessible. And it's, responsive, and we use a lot of modern technologies and techniques. Apple has some beautiful things on their site. I think that the BBC is worth looking at. I think that Google has made some real strides in a lot of their document accessibility, like Google Drive applications. They're making great efforts towards making those more accessible. The accessibility is always a moving target in that sense for large organizations. I would be very interested in looking at December 12th, any airline that works with the United States customers and passengers has to comply with the Department of Transportation accessibility requirements. This has been several years in the making, and more than any other industry, airlines have the worst legacy code because they don't want to change anything because there's flights and code share and possibly planes in the air. And so it's a very scary prospect for them to update their code. So we worked with one airline and we saw 9 different jQuery libraries, all actively in use, which is a train wreck. It was so spaghetti-like. With that said, they all have to come into compliance, and the Department of Transportation has required usability testing with people with disabilities. So it's not just a technical standard they have to meet, they have to functionally be usable. So full disclosure, this client is, like, they are our client, but I think JetBlue is making some tremendous strides. So I know intimately the work that they're doing, so I think that there's some benefits. They put a lot of attention in that. It's really, Scotiabank is in Canada. It's a Toronto-based bank. They do quite a lot. Again, these are some of our clients, so it feels a little bit weird to tell you because it sounds like it's about us when it's not. It's just because I know the teams behind it. So I hope that's helpful. Anything else? I think it's lunchtime, and thank you guys so much for joining me on this mad dash through lean accessibility. So the other thing I'll tell you is content's going to be published in a book form early 2017. If you want more stuff about this kind of topic, this is something that we're writing a lot about. We're producing like little guides that we're sending anybody who'd like them. Feel free to drop us an email. And I have some of these design cards if you guys want to take a look at it. And I have a hole punch, so you can use the straw test. So thanks very much, and I appreciate it.